still have not had the leader that is capable of fulfilling the potential of the political system to change things. Bobby Kennedy Jr. Displayed some of those characteristics that we would need. He's an extraordinary person, but the inconsistencies in his messages, especially around peace, am not 100% the kind of leader who could transform the political system through his involvement in it. Donald Trump is certainly not that leader either, although again, displays some of the characteristics. And when people see even just a small subset of those characteristics, it fills them with hope.
What would you say are some of those characteristics that could mobilize the types of change that we were alluding to? Greetings and welcome to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast, the show where we dive deep into some of the world's most pressing issues and explore how to live free and prosper. I'm delighted to welcome Charles Eisenstein, who's a returning guest to the show, who has made many prominent assessments of the changing nature of our times over the years, but really, in my view, was one of the most critical voices during the course of the pandemic response, which led many of us to explore how does this period in history become a transformational period in history in terms of our collective and spiritual journey where we are in humanity. And interestingly, beyond that period, Charles found himself working within the political domain. And today we're going to explore what that experience was like and what the political realm offers right now. Is it a place where transformation can occur? What role does it play in the overall systemic picture? And Charles's view on where we are on the more beautiful world that we know is possible. So Charles, it's great to have you back. Welcome again to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. I think many of us had a sense of hope when we saw that Robert Kennedy Jr. would be running for president. And you found yourself in a unique position where not only were you I assume encouraged as well by that decision, but actually joined his campaign as an advisor. Could you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Well, I didn't know he was running until he told me, basically. And the way that happened is I was by random chance, I ended up at a falconry event that one of my readers had won a raffle to attend. Amidst the circus of that event, there were a lot of people. I had a few words with Bobby, and he was really interested in what I had to say. And we started, texting. And then he invited me to present to his campaign formation committee. And, I just kind of got drawn in pretty deep, pretty fast, and put down everything else that I was doing to become his speechwriter and just to kind of lay down basic campaign messaging and a policy rubric and things like that. There were some heady days at the beginning, and you're right, I was very hopeful about what this could become, and that I'm not sure how quote political I want to get right now too fast. There were some serious disagreements I had with him on various issues, and and I kind of lost heart, and I stuck around for still quite a while because I thought that he was still far better than the other two alternatives. But eventually it became, eventually there wasn't that much for me to do once the basic stuff had been put into place and some of it abandoned, actually. Do you really need a campaign philosopher when things have become quite entrenched and in many ways very conventional? So, so eventually I we kind of parted ways, although I'm still, we're still friends. I just want to note, the reason I was just very interested looking at my hesitation to actually name the issues on which we diverged as political. because a lot of what we are offered as the issues, and here's the conversation you should be having, is actually too narrow and too shallow and artificially divisive. Because like you could always find something to disagree on with any human being. I'm sure you and I disagree on some things, and we could spend this whole time arguing about that. And I'm not saying that we should shy away from those debates. However, if we only focus on that, we're going to miss anything that could unify us, anything that we could ally on, and we'll miss the questions that no one bothers to even talk about because they're not one of the issues. So I just wanted to add that note in there, but yeah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, no, that's a marvelous piece of self-awareness. And interestingly enough, this is just my own observation. I remember listening to a lot of Ram Dass during this period as a kind of go-to resource for sanity at key points. And he also spoke about how he became in many ways embedded in the political system, I think probably to play a very similar role that you attempted to play in terms of providing that philosophical or spiritual dimension to a very, sometimes many would argue is not a philosophical or spiritual dimension, even though it should be. So I will come back to how he handled some of those disagreements, because I think some of those you've publicly spoken about, and I think the difficult thing is I find with all of this, and I want to riff off your piece around finding common ground, is that what I've observed over the last decade or so is this increasing fragmented landscape in the social space, which has created this deeply polarized environment. And, identity politics has been wrapped up in the kind of culture wars. But I think it extends beyond that, because we're in a place now where people will follow an individual based upon a certain view. But the moment that they have a different view on something else, they then abandon hope in that individual and, flee the ship, if you will. And I've come to reflect that if you want someone to see the world exactly how you do, then the only place you will find that is in the mirror. And that becomes a very lonely existence. So in this deeply fragmented environment, I agree with what you're saying around how we find that common ground. But I'm sure we will all have our points where we have a boundary, which is a value-based or principle-based boundary that makes things difficult. So I'm curious, specifically, how you navigated some of those disagreements early on. And I know, you've spoken about Israel. How did you initially respond?
Yeah. Okay, I will answer that question, but first I just want to comment on what you were calling identity politics. I mean, normally that means something about, race or, gender or something like that. But another way to understand it is that people use their political opinions as a badge of identity and belonging.
Yes.
And at a time when so many other ways of belonging have disintegrated, that are local, community-based, people have a real crisis of identity, and they don't feel like they belong. They don't have a tribe. So in that situation, they are very vulnerable, very susceptible to political offerings that say, here's who you are. You can identify with us. So they're very, very predisposed to us versus them rhetoric. Even if they don't, they might fervently voice certain opinions about various issues, like, I don't know, like transgender, sports, transgender people in sports, or, gun control or something like that. But if you take them out of that context and you say, okay, what are the most crucial issues facing humanity right now? I mean, is it really, whether trans women can compete in women's sports? I mean, come on, like the rainforest is burning, like we're on the verge of nuclear war, like artificial intelligence is sweeping like a tsunami over society. I mean, there's so many things that we could talk about. And really, this, well, why is it so important? It's because it identifies them. It's a badge. It's like a clubhouse badge that you wear that identifies you as part of this group. And so that, um, so, I have to, if to the extent that I'm involved in politics, and right now I'm not directly involved, um, but I have to be very clear in myself what differences of opinion offend me because it marks us as separate, and what is actually a core conviction that's not about which uh, opinion tribe I belong to, that I can signal online and people will cheer me or deplore me. But what is actually a core conviction, you know? Um, and so the issue you mentioned, Israel Palestine, was one of those core issues that uh, that is not isolatable from everything else. So to be specific, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Adopted a very hardline pro-Zionist position. I won't call it pro-Israel, because I believe that Israel's policies are actually going to destroy their country. Either literally destroy it as a political entity or destroy it as a place worth living in. So I think that I mean, already, like, this terminology, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, it already seeds the conversation with false assumptions. So anyway, he had a very hardline pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, I mean, pro-Zionist position. And, and I was absolutely appalled at what was happening in Gaza. I was devastated. And but he was, his position was that the IDF is the most moral army in the world. They're doing everything they can to avoid civilian casualties. They have no choice but to do this because they're surrounded by enemies who want to wipe every Jew off the face of the earth. The casualties in any case in Gaza are exaggerated. The aid organizations are anti-Semitic, like this. The whole nine yards of a very partisan position. And I don't demand that somebody who I work with agree with me on everything, but as I say, you can't isolate this. If you're going to be pro-peace, then you have to be willing to see conflicts in terms other than who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Because once you see it in those terms and you see one group as being just irredeemably bad, then what solution is there except armed conflict? Because they are crazy. They're incomprehensible. They're just bloodthirsty. That is the irreducible character of those people. And that means that there's no hope for redemption. That means that changing the conditions isn't going to matter. Because I asked, okay, if people commit terrorist acts, where is that coming from? What does it take to make somebody up into a political extremist? Is it just that their religion teaches hate? Or do those teachings find fertile soil in the social and political conditions that they are living in? And how can we change those conditions? Like, there's a whole lot, there's a much more sophisticated way of thinking about these things, instead of defaulting to, okay, I'm going to take this side. And that's, to me, what peace consciousness is. It looks at the conditions of violence and seeks to change those. And that becomes very uncomfortable if you are an oppressor, because then the conditions of violence include the things that you've been doing. And this is the human drama that's been playing out for thousands of years. And our country, my country, the United States, with Britain as its sidekick, has been doing this ever since World War II, if not before. The generating resistance through imperial domination, and then using that resistance as justification for further domination. So that is a picture that I would love to see any political candidate acknowledge. And, Bobby Kennedy came close to acknowledging that. But then, I felt like on this issue, kind of abandoned that understanding. And so it was really heartbreaking for me. And that's what demoralized me.
I think a lot of us shared that feeling, Charles. I know a lot of my peer group who had a lot of hope. And in many ways, we'll transition to talk about the role that Bobby may now play in the Trump administration in a more defined field. Nonetheless, I think for many, there was a point where there was this real sense that something could happen, and then a point of deflation that came with that on that particular issue, which was a deal breaker for many. And it's interesting you talk about political badge, and that is exactly my intention when I use that term identity politics, because I know it has become synonymous with the culture wars, but that for me is now applicable to almost any political issue. And I'm reminded, actually, I recently visited this beautiful seaside town called Teignmouth in the south coast of Devon in the United Kingdom, where I grew up, actually. And I walked past this badge shop, and I haven't seen a badge shop for many, many years. And there were thousands of badges in there. And I thought, how does a badge shop survive in this modern day? But it reminded me of, that's really what when we think about different issues, there should be thousands of badges for every issue. But we've actually just got, you could say we've got 2, maybe 3 badges. It's either this, I see the world this way or that way. And the third badge is, I don't see either of those ways. And all that complexity is then taken out. And it makes it so hard then to navigate this world where it's either this or that. And I think that is playing out in the overall paradigm when it comes to the political realm at this moment. And I'm not sure how we can orientate ourselves out of this. And it will lead into the conversation around AI, because I'm seeing the birth of blue AI and red AI, and this point in history being baked into the technologies. I want to come back to that a bit later, and just wrap up on this piece around Bobby Kennedy, because he's joined now the Trump administration in a role around health, make America healthy again. Irrespective of your views on your points of difference around Israel and perhaps other issues, do you think he can make a real difference in his role, going up against some of the opponents that he's long fought against, who now become under his report if he gets the role? Do you believe he can make a real difference through the political mechanism? Before we continue, I want to let you know that in order to sustain this show, we're now partnering with brands that truly represent the values that we stand for, ultimately with the goal of helping you to discover products and services that can make a difference to the quality of your life, whilst helping us to grow the impact of our show. Have you noticed the financial world is shifting? Inflation is eating away at savings, banks are becoming harder to trust, and central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are looming on the horizon, threatening to erode financial autonomy as we know it. If you've been thinking about crypto as a way to protect your wealth, but feel overwhelmed, worried about scams, or confused by all the technology, then you're not alone. This is exactly why we created the Navigating Digital Assets course, a fully updated, beginner-friendly course designed to help you to securely navigate the world of crypto and digital assets with confidence. This course has already helped over 500 people to gain clarity on how crypto works, how to invest safely, and how to secure your assets in an ever-changing financial landscape. With holistic guidance, jargon-free explanations, and £197 worth of bonuses, this course will give you the tools and confidence to navigate this paradigm shift in finance. And as a follower of this show, you can get 40% off the regular price and enroll for just £29. But don't wait, this offer will end soon. Visit danastin-gregory.com/NDA today and take the first step toward protecting your wealth and securing your financial independence. You'll find the link below this content. Do you believe he can make a real difference through the political mechanism?
Yes, I do, because there's tremendous popular support for the agenda that he's bringing into the administration. People, people are really waking up to the crisis, the chronic disease crisis in this country. They know that it doesn't have to be this way. They are understanding now. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people are understanding that something went drastically wrong in the COVID response. You know, even just in my circles, normal people, like in, among my relatives and local people here, I'm not talking about my intellectual circles, but just people who dutifully, wore their masks and socially isolated and stayed indoors and got the jab and so on and so forth, fully believing everything that they were told. They kind of know that they were deceived. Because they got the jab and then they still got COVID, and not just a few of them, all of them pretty much. It happened to everybody. And so even if they don't explicitly repudiate the beliefs that they had during COVID, they are no longer resistant to a dramatic change of course. So, and then of course, there's the people who are radicalized and energized by what happened during COVID, and so yeah, people, the crisis has reached such proportions that I do think that there's a lot of public support for what Kennedy wants to do, and Trump is on board with it, and I think even a lot of people in the establishment, they might profess to be appalled at Kennedy's positions, but they're not, like, it's kind of gotten to them too. They're not quite as fervent in their desire to uphold the orthodoxy. So I think that he really can have a powerful effect in government.
Yeah, well, I'm curious whether your own personal experience, the kind of glimpse inside the political machine, will reveal. I mean, you referred to how it almost came to a point where you hit against political convention. I wonder if there's a risk that Bobby's principles and values could be compromised by a system that is built to sustain itself. And I reference a point which I've been accused of oversimplifying, but I think it has merit. There was the photograph of Bobby Kennedy on the flight with Trump, and they had their McDonald's and their sodas. And it felt to me, I thought it felt almost like a playful prank. I could almost imagine Elon and Donald Trump playing a trick on him. But in a way, to be even photographed with that, it could be meaningless. But at the same time, I wondered, is this a slight opening of the political machine and how group dynamics and the political context slowly erodes at one's ability to act in accordance fully with his or her principles? What do you think? Does the machine?
No, I wouldn't read too much into that.
Yeah, so maybe I was oversimplifying it, but
he's not a Puritan. We don't want anybody to be a Puritan.
I agree with that. I do agree. But he only a few minutes ago he'd said he hadn't had a soda in 10 years, and I just wonder, does the machine? And I'm playful with that example, but I'm more broadly, systemically. Does the goodwill of an individual get usurped by the strength and might of the machine in which it enters?
I think it's more that, that certainly happens, especially in foreign policy. People get into the system and then they get their CIA briefings and their NSA briefings, and they enter into that worldview, and they abandon their commitment to peace and their anti-imperialistic sentiments, and they go over to the dark side, kind of. So that can happen, but I think what is a more formidable obstacle is simply the inertia of the institutions and systems that he's trying to change. just because you want to say promote regenerative agriculture doesn't mean that there's an easy way to do that in the current regulatory framework. Like there's these whole systems of subsidies that maybe require congressional action to change. There are massive, thousands of pages of regulations that need to be either rewritten or, maybe just interpreted and enforced differently. And to do that, there are personnel, in civil servants in these gigantic bureaucracies that are, just because they have a new boss's boss doesn't mean that they're going to be doing anything differently until they're told to do something differently. And then they might resist it. Maybe because they have an ideological opposition to the changes, but maybe because they just don't want to do things differently the way they've been doing them. And it's hard to do something differently when the people around you are not doing something differently. And they are not going to do anything differently because you're not doing anything differently. So like these organizations have a life of their own. They have an inertia. Changing the people at the top, it's not, useless, but it's not so easy to, change the course of the Titanic when you're just given the rudder. It takes a lot of organizational acumen and political skills. And there's to translate a broad vision of reorienting the entire public health system toward chronic disease into actual policies is a tall order.
Yeah, but there's a couple of things that give me hope on that. Firstly, that your first point around the public will, and I think that there is a large base of people who I think will be cheering on that activity, and I think it's important because and this will lead on to our next part of the conversation, because I think there is a great deal of what I would call hopium around the political changes that are occurring, and that there's almost this outsourcing of personal responsibility that accompanies that. But I think this is a great time now for that energy to mobilize to support the change that is possible. And again, whatever one might think about the corporate arena, there is some great examples in history where there's been a change in CEO and the entire company culture has shifted as a result of that change. And they would have similar embedded barriers that you've articulated. So both of those still give me hope. Before we come on to talk about that kind of response to the election more broadly and the kind of hopium and despair, again, just two binary reactions that have emerged, does your direct response did your direct experience of being involved in the campaign enhance your view on the political system as a way to change society, or has it diminished it?
I think that all along I've recognized the limitations of the political system as being the fountainhead of change. It's much more a barometer of change, and but it's not irrelevant, of course. So it was a little disheartening, I would have to say, to witness firsthand the pretty much insuperable barriers to a third party in this country. And the power of legacy institutions. That was sobering. But yeah, I guess I would say, and I have said this actually, that we still have not had the leader that has that is capable of fulfilling the potential of the political system to change things. Bobby Kennedy Jr. Displayed some of those characteristics that we would need. He has many excellent personal qualities. He's an extraordinary person. But the inconsistencies in his messages, especially around peace, and maybe some other issues too, made him not 100% the kind of leader who could transform the political system through his involvement in it. Donald Trump is certainly not that leader either, although again displays some of the characteristics that, and when people see even just a small subset of those characteristics, it fills them with hope because they recognize a possibility. That possibility has yet to actually appear on the political landscape. And maybe, what we saw with Kennedy, what we're seeing with Trump is a harbinger of a movement that has yet to fully take form. That's what the optimistic, hopeful side of me believes.
Just before we move on from that, at this point, what would you say are some of those characteristics that could mobilize the types of change that we were alluding to?
Well, one is total authenticity. Repudiation of any kind of, the whole way of campaigning of photo ops, and just being really careful what you say because, the just the insincerity. People are fed up with that. One reason that they love Trump is that even when he's lying, he's still sincere. Yes. He's still himself, and people appreciate that. But I would love to see a candidate who, faced with questions about some issue is willing to say, I don't know what the answer to that is. And
for the first time in history, someone said that out.
And I don't have a plan actually. I'm working on one, but no one I've talked to really has any idea how to solve this problem. Like just that kind of honesty, because the predicament of civilization in large part comes from a false understanding of the problems and the solutions. And therefore we continue to pursue false solutions, futile solutions that just make the situation worse and worse and worse, because we think that we know. We don't actually take the time to pause in the unknowing in order that a solution or a course of action that is totally outside of what we have believed in the past is able to emerge.
Do you think that's a function, again, of the system itself? And again, I think of an example as a parallel almost as human health, because the short term, if you're feeling unwell, you may take a pill or put on a Band-Aid, which may solve the symptom or heal the symptom or ease the symptom. But ultimately, in order to transform one's health, you have to understand not only what is the problem that you're facing, the true definition or diagnosis of the problem, but actually the root cause behind that problem. And often to heal the root cause is not a quick fix. It's a long-term transformation. And with the political realm, it feels almost identical in that there are quick fix, symptomatic solutions that rarely even actually define the problem, let alone get to the root cause of the issue.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I have a friend who's brilliant guy, but as like a teenager, he wasn't paying attention in class, so they gave him, Ritalin or Adderall or something, and then he was paying attention, but that caused another problem, so they gave him, an SSRI, and then they gave him an antipsychotic, and then they gave him this and that. Pretty soon he was on like 10 different medications, getting more and more miserable, more and more suicidal. And the solution each time was more medicine. And it was only when he recognized the entire pattern and stepped away from that he was able to heal. So right now, I mean, this is a civilizational condition of addiction to You could call it the technical fix. It happens in every domain, like agriculture. You have pest problems. You apply a pesticide, and that causes resistance to the pesticide. So you apply another pesticide, and then that depletes soil fertility. So you add more fertilizer, and that has poisons the groundwater. So you have a new filtering system, or you pipe water in from somewhere else, and like just one problem after another, each generated by previous technology, each met with further technology. Now we have to genetically engineer the plants in order to be resistant to the conditions that we've created through previous technology. And so it's very much an addictive pattern that you need more and more and more of the drug, which is technology, or in the social sphere, you need more and more of the drug called control in order to deal with the consequences of previous efforts to control. You see this in, the Middle East, where if you subject a population to occupation and oppression, then the resistance that generates requires even more thorough forms of surveillance and control and murder, ultimately, in order to keep them under control. And the ideology is that, it gets very fascistic, because where that leads you is to the final solution. Then we just exterminate the problem. If we exterminate the weeds once and for all, if we have a perfect antibiotic that can kill every bacteria, if we have a perfect herbicide, if we have a watertight system of surveillance that can monitor each human being's every action and use AI predictive technology to anticipate any act, any illegal act, then finally we'll be able to have a perfect society. So there's this holy grail, this final solution that we chase like a mirage on the horizon, never actually getting any closer, never actually getting healthier, never actually getting saner, never actually getting happier or more secure. It's always on the horizon.
It feels to me this type of thinking, though, is permeating our culture right now. Whether it's zero COVID or
Yes.
I just don't know how we got here and whether the tide is turning. And in fact, I suppose if we were to transition to talk about the US election, I think some people are seeing that as a potential transition point. If politics is historically downstream from culture, people have speculated that, conservatism is the new counterculture. Is this a point? Is this a turning point? Is the US election a turning point in that type of thinking? Could it be a threat to that type of thinking? What do you think?
Yeah, I could say a lot about that. Conservatism isn't what it used to be. And in many ways, those who brand themselves as conservatives have adopted many ideas that would have once been called liberal. So who's conservative and who's liberal, who's left and who's right now, it's all getting mixed up. And these have become very much, again, like badges or brands on a certain group. I think the more significant category to apply to the current political realignment is authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism. And the anti-authoritarians now are starting to overlap with the working class, as is natural. And then this is happening not just in the United States, it's happening all over the world, especially in Europe. They get branded right-wing, but a lot of the policies that they're advocating are anything but right-wing in the traditional sense. They're not militaristic. They're even the anti-immigrant stuff. Traditionally it was the left that was against immigration because it would undercut wages. And they were representatives of the working class. And the right wanted unlimited immigration in order to dilute the power of organized labor. So, again, this is now for me, like that whole debate is an artificial one because it neglects to really examine the causes of immigration. And if you take for granted that people are always going to want to immigrate into the United States or to Great Britain, and you don't ask why, then you're just not going to understand the situation. And you're going to risk perpetuating those conditions. Why do people want to leave their homes and their language and their culture and everything that they've known to make an uncertain and illegal and dangerous journey? Why would they do that? What makes life so unlivable where they were born? Well, the answer is, the things that our countries have been doing in the world that makes these other places so unlivable. So, if you're living in a medieval kingdom and one village is, stealing the grain from the other village and doing terrible things to them and poisoning their wells and so forth, and then they wonder why refugees from that village are invading their own village, it's quite obvious. And that's kind of what's been happening over the last, 50 or 100 years. And so that dimension is just mostly absent from the conversation about immigration, which means that this left-right divide is artificial. So anyway, I do think that, excuse me, the political realignment that we're seeing is an expression of a much deeper change in not just politics, but I even take it down to the basic mythology of our civilization, our basic understanding of who we are and how the world works and what is real and what is possible. And that story that gave order and sense and meaning to the world and gave identity to ourselves is breaking down. Cracks are forming and spreading in that container of reality, of official reality, of orthodoxy. And some recent events like all those inexplicable drones that are all over the place, in the UK here and here as well, and the UAPs, which I still prefer to call UFOs because, anyway, that's a whole other thing. You make a more scientific sounding word to legitimize it. What's wrong with flying saucers?
Yes.
Yeah. I like a good old fashioned flying saucer. But anyway, but these, these are each one of these phenomena is a body blow to the container of reality. And there's so many more, in the realm of this is related to the Kennedy phenomenon in the realm of health. It's not just that the old ways aren't working, it's that people have experienced other modalities that have been persecuted and outlawed and suppressed by the people in authority. And they work, and people have direct experiences of them working. How can you believe and trust the authorities when they tell you that what healed your cancer is crackery or is unproven or is misinformation? So this also is eroding the foundations of official reality. So and I could name many, many other things. There's a film coming out. It's being made right now about telepathy in autistic children. And there's even a podcast out there about that. I can't remember what the name of it is, but I listened to one episode, and you just cannot explain away what these parents are experiencing, and they've subjected it to pretty rigorous experiments now, where they have them in separate rooms and so forth, and these children who are nonverbal can point to the pictures that their parents are looking at in another room, or to the letters of words that they're reading, and so and most people, not everybody, but most people have had experiences that violate reality as it has been narrated to us, but we kind of keep them secret. You don't talk about them because then you seem like a crazy person. The definition of crazy being somebody who does not accept reality that everybody else accepts. So I hope I'm not talking too long here, but this is just a multi-dimensional collapse of the sense and meaning and identity that we're used to. So the political disruptions, the political realignments are just one aspect of a much bigger process.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that is some wonderful framing for understanding that, because I think that is important to understand where it fits into the puzzle. I mean, if we do zoom in to look at the political element, your experience gave you a front row seat to some of those crumbling narratives that we've touched upon and the deeper fractures in society. And in fact, one of the reasons that compelled us to reach out to you again and have you back on the show, I mean, we're always happy to talk to you, but there was your Substack article, which talked about how the election may not mean what any of us think. It kind of gave me a sense of inner calm in a storm of hysteria. And however you look at it, in the wake of the election result, it was hysterical on both sides of this two-team sport that has emerged called politics. And you had the hopium element, which is almost down to the point that almost a literal and even metaphorical second coming, in the literal sense, Trump coming back into power, but there's almost this messianic, mimetic, mythic figure that has emerged as the savior of America and humankind. And that, he's untouchable to the point where he can literally survive multiple assassination attempts. Then to the opposite side of that, which is literal, deep, screaming despair that the ultimate tyrant is back, despite having previously endured 4 years. For those who hold that opinion, they've seen 4 years of his activity and hasn't fully realized in the way that they perhaps forecast. But we have these two polarizing forces emerging. And I read your article and it just brought me back to leave that over there for a minute and just come back to sanity. What was your intention behind that? And I think it was a transcription actually of a talk that you'd given. What was the central message for those who haven't read it?
Yeah, well, partly it was to chill out. That Trump is neither the monster nor the hero that people think he is.
It's time for a quick word from one of our partners. If you believe in the freedom to communicate, the right to privacy, and freedom from corporate surveillance, then you need to check out Proton. Many of you would have heard of Proton Mail. Proton is born out of the desire to create an internet that puts people before profits. Proton helps you to maintain control over your digital life, whether it's sending messages encrypted through Proton Mail or browsing privately with Proton VPN or securely storing your important documents with Proton Drive. Proton is the ultimate tool for safeguarding your digital freedom. Don't let your data be sold or your privacy be compromised. Go to danastingregory.com/Proton and start using Proton to protect your digital life today.
Trump is neither the monster nor the hero that people think he is. But also to illuminate some of these identities that form around the projection of those qualities onto him, and the false certainty, the false meaning making, the false sense making that comes from those projections, which obliterates a lot of what's actually going on and what's actually possible right now.
Could you expand on that a little? What you mean in terms of the false sense making around those narratives?
Yeah, like one direction of false sense making is that, okay, he's going to be the new Hitler. He's going to round up political opponents in concentration camps and imprison his rivals, and uh, uh, institute a Christian white nationalist fascist state. Like a lot of people were genuinely distraught, fully believing that was going to happen. And I knew just from some of my somewhat insider experience in this whole thing that he's not going to do anything of the sort. That's just there's just no basis for that kind of fear. He's just not. That's just not who he is at all. Mm. And then on the other hand, that he's this. The other way of making sense is that he's this hero who's going to overthrow the deep state, root out all the corruption, and restore America to greatness. And that he's like some master of the 4D chess game of politics, and that's also completely unhinged from what I've seen. So if you are intoxicated with one of those two versions of reality, how are you going to be effective in the nuts and bolts of creating change and doing the things that actually need to be done? That you're not going to be absolved from this very unsexy, tedious work of building a better world. No one's going to come and swoop in and do it for you, nor is it totally hopeless because the forces of evil are too powerful. See if there's another thing I want to say about it. Yeah, so part of that, I think, I'm not sure if I remembered exactly, but the take home of that essay was that not just those two ways of making sense of it all, but any way that we have right now of making sense of it all is going to fall short because processes are in motion that are going to bewilder everybody at one point. And this is, maybe related to the UAP stuff, and these this expanded reality that is coming in now that the old story is faltering and isn't working very well. We are going to experience events that don't fit into almost anybody's way of making sense of the world. We can try to fit them in by force, as people often do. They can, narrate, like say the truckers' protest in Canada a few years ago. They can deny what it actually is, and they can say, well, that's just, right-wing zealots. That's it was a white supremacist movement. I mean, that was the narrative, even though the organizers, one of them was, an indigenous person, I mean, it wasn't that at all, but that's how it was narrated. Like if you are totally unwilling to let go of your worldview, to let go of your beliefs, there is no evidence that can force you to do that. No matter what happens, you can explain it away somehow. Like this is what's happening in Palestine. I look sometimes at postings from people in Gaza, documenting horrible things, and the comments on those fake. Like in the age of AI, any photo, any video could be fake. So there you have a way to dismiss any evidence that challenges your worldview. And this is only going to get worse. This is one aspect of the crisis that we're entering, is that there is no it's ironic that the photograph and the film that once offered us a common ground of objective truth. Like you can't argue with a photograph, there it is, the My Lai massacre, um, like you can't deny it. It gave humanity a common ground that was impossible when everything was just hearsay. When you had to take somebody's word for it that something happened. Now we had, in the age of the photograph, we had an objective source of truth, but we don't have that anymore. We're kind of back to the days of where you had to trust the source of the information and not the information itself. We're kind of re-entering those days, which is why governments are so keen to control artificial intelligence, because then they can tell you what is real. They will be able to control what the public accepts as reality. So there's kind of an ontological war happening.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. That's
Yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of what I alluded to with the kind of red AI, blue AI, and I think those elements will play out. The polarization will play out, but the construction of narratives and reality will emerge. And of course, we're still at the infancy, really, of AI's development, although it's growing at absolute speed. But its overall integration into widespread society will make it increasingly harder to discern what is real and what is not real. And even in the wake of the election, there was false clips created, deep fakes of Trump making certain speeches about certain issues, and they would proliferate the internet, and everyone said that Trump is doing this, and you'd find that there's no actual record of that speech, and then it's dismissed. And this is just the beginning. I mean, how do you? I know you've been exploring this and looking to write on this even more frequently, but how do we begin to even navigate this environment?
Well, I mean, one thing is I don't think it's a bad thing now that we have to return to relationships of trust,
Mm.
and then also there's a whole realm of information that is outside of the digital, that is outside the internet, and we have to start sourcing from there also.
Mm.
So the artificial intelligence, generative AI, is in a way it's the fulfillment, it's the culmination of an entire era of history. The sum total of recorded human knowledge is now available to us. That it's like this database that AI is essentially a new way to query that database of all knowledge and all cognition, but only recorded knowledge and the kind of cognition that applies to that particular kind of knowledge. The ideology of progress believes that all knowledge can take that form, that anything real can be quantified, that can be digitized, can be simulated, that the brain is essentially a processor of bits of information. And if you believe that, then there's no limit to the intelligence that machines can develop, and no limit to the accuracy of their simulations. But when you accept other kinds of knowledge, other ways of knowing, then the limits of AI become apparent. So, yeah, the future of the human realm, including work, is going to be in the areas that AI cannot touch because they are qualitative, not quantitative. They are material, not virtual. And that's like, I don't know, that's like a one sentence summary of, a 10,000 word essay probably. But that's one of the lines along which I'm thinking.
Well, I'd may like to come back to that in a moment, but
Yeah.
just if I zoom into a piece that led us down that path around the kind of narratives of the world and the collapsing of narratives and this potential dissonance that we may be facing and confronting. And there was a particular line that I scribbled down from the transcript, which was, "We will be asked more and more insistently to put down what we thought we knew." I'd love you to expand on that. What did you mean by that? If we've it felt like a willingness to let go of what we think we know.
Yeah, that's what I'm, when I speak about the UAPs, and these so-called anomalies.
I suppose my deeper question on this is how do we cultivate a sense of openness in this world of rigid A versus B binaries that are so divisive and polarized, and it almost becomes an unconscious way of living. And I almost think we're living in this great inversion. It's, people who were spiritual, vegan, and liberal yesterday are now carnivore, conservative,
Yeah.
and religious today. But it almost goes in tribes, and maybe might have Matthias Desmet on to talk about mass formation in reverse. But I do wonder, how do we retain that set? How do we almost like that moment of that I had from reading the essay? How do we as individuals extract ourselves from that pull towards binary narratives and retain a sense of openness?
Yeah, that's the meta pattern, like to it's one level of uh of release, one level of letting go to say, oh, I was on the wrong side, and to switch sides. But it's a whole other level to let go of that kind of binary thinking in the first place, that kind of us versus them thinking, and to really be in the unknown. A lot of cults target people who have been in a belief system that is just not working for them. And they say, here's another belief system. This will work for you. And this tells you how to live. This tells you who you are. This tells you what's important. This tells you who to believe. Here's a whole other system for identifying what's true and what's valuable. And in the discomfort of the breakdown of the old belief system, people very willingly leap into a new totalizing belief system. And this is what totalitarian political movements offer as well. They're very much like a cult in their rejection of anybody who doesn't adopt the dogmas of the cult. There's just many ways that here's a new identity for you. It's not just a new belief system, it's a new identity. People are vulnerable to that when they are not comfortable with the place in between the stories, when they're not comfortable with the unknowing. And we have to, as things break down, if we're not going to just jump from one to the next totalizing narrative. Oh, it's the deep state cabal that's orchestrating everything. I mean, and all of a sudden the world makes sense again. I want to cultivate a deeper kind of well-being in the world, a deeper kind of security that doesn't depend on having everything make sense, where we can abide in the unknowing for a long enough time that we're not just getting a new version of the old belief system with the roles reversed as to good guy and bad guy, but where we're actually stepping into a next story that's not the old story in code, because we've been through this so many times.
Yeah, that's my fear about this period, which on the surface could seem transformational, but I just wonder if it's just another cycle. And Ken Wilber's work kind of talks about it as even though it may be cyclical, it is evolving. It's like an evolution in a cyclical format. And maybe that is true. Maybe there is an evolution, but I'm curious. I'm not convinced in the path of evolution that society is on with some of the things we've talked about, touching on AI. But nonetheless, we are in a transformational period. And I kind of want to, my next question in the context of that deeper exploration is much more futile, and it may be irrelevant given what you've already stated about anyone's assessment of where Trump may lie in this whole picture. But if you did have an assessment on what role he represents in this transformational period, not only for America, but potentially given its ramifications of the American hegemony and its role in the evolution of humankind, what does he represent to you in this moment of history?
I think that he will begin to pry the lid off of Pandora's box, and the secrets and lies and shadows that have been in that box, in our collective unconscious, in the fringes and margins of society, they're going to start popping out. And once that happens, that process will take on a life of its own, far beyond what he could imagine. On the other hand, what really concerns me is the ways in which Trump is simply recycling old patterns and switching the roles of good guy and bad guy, and I mean, all this America First stuff, it's still us versus them. It still generates even though his instincts are, he's very averse to war. He does not want to start wars. He hates war. But if you're in that mindset, enemies are going to pop up, and it's going to be very hard not to go to war. So, if you've identified Iran, China as the bad guy instead of Russia, that's not going to really change anything. That perception, like the basic perceptual template of us versus them, who's the us, who's the them, that orders the world into conformity with that perspective. You start treating people like enemies, and they become enemies. And then you say, see, I was right. They are, hostile. They're aggressive. They're pursuing their own interests at the expense of ours. But if you had approached them differently from the outset, would they be that way? We haven't really tried that, have we?
My nervous laughter actually has struck a chord. It's right. And you've actually preempted my next question, which would be, given this kind of cyclical nature and the reduction to us versus them, good versus evil. I mean, good versus evil as a societal myth has become almost inescapable. It's permeated almost all of history. So my follow-on question would have been, what are some of the old stories or old narratives that we truly need to let go of in order to make this a transformational era? Because if we just cling on to different versions or different colored versions of the same stories in inversion, then it will just repeat itself, and the pendulum will swing from one side to the other, and we will go through this whole thing again. What story?
I mean, good versus evil is one of them, which is actually a layer above some of the deeper myths, which would be the myth of separation, the myth of and the necessity for control that comes from that. So the myth of separation essentially says that there's the human realm, and which is the abode of intelligence and purpose and consciousness. And then there's the random forces of nature outside of the human realm. Therefore, progress means to impose order onto chaos, to impose intelligence onto randomness, to impose civilization onto the wild, to bring intelligence to a world that has none of its own, to become the lords and masters of creation. So once you accept this separation of human from nature, a certain version of progress based on increasing our control is inevitable. So the transition then would be into an understanding that consciousness, intelligence, aliveness are properties, are universal properties. They're not just in us, and that therefore the human role isn't just to impose order, to impose purpose, to impose intelligence, but to participate in a larger purpose and intelligence that unfolds through us. And then we no longer need to control everything in order to make the world better. But we can look to the intelligence beyond ourselves, the intelligence of the soil, the intelligence of biodiversity, and the how can we feed that rather than how do we suppress that? So a tremendous increase in our creativity is possible when we no longer have to do it all ourselves. And you see the results, a lot of the, quote, alternative healing modalities leverage the intelligence of the body. They don't seek to suppress, levels of hormones or neurotransmitters or something like that in the body, but they say, oh, why is it out of balance? How can I restore balance? How can I give the body what it needs to restore balance? It's very similar to peace consciousness when it comes to, oh, there's, violence here, there's terrorism here, there's discontent. Instead of suppressing it, how do we change those conditions? It's the same mindset.
Where this leads me to is the concept of a more beautiful world. You've started I don't know how long it's been in existence for now, but a more beautiful world progress report. I'm curious if Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is an appropriate story arc for our pursuit towards a world that is more beautiful. And if it is, where would you say we are? According to your progress report, how are we doing? Where are we on that journey towards that more beautiful world?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's actually the right myth to guide us in coming times. It's a very powerful universal myth, but it's not the only myth in the pantheon. That myth is that the hero's journey is the story of adolescence, of a boy becoming a man. But it doesn't say that much about what happens after Luke Skywalker gets the medal pinned to him by Princess Leia. And comes back from his journey and rejoins the community and is no longer the hero. Maybe we don't need more hero thinking. Maybe we've been on the hero's journey already as a civilization and have gained tremendous powers and have gazed into the darkness of our souls through all that has happened, all that we've done to each other. Maybe now we are at the point of the return where we say, okay, how do now I contribute to the community of all life? How do I take my place in the tribe having been initiated into adulthood. What is mine to do now? And maybe, it's a more humble position than the hero in front of the adoring crowd getting the medal. So,
Wow, I'm welling up, man. I mean, because it actually feels like we were talking about societal journeys, but that feels like where I'm at as an adult. I feel deeply that hero's journey that I've been on as an not to become an external hero, but to having to become a hero to myself in order to overcome some of my own challenges and demons to get to a place of understanding. And I've followed that story arc. And as I turned 40 last year, I reached a point of feeling like I was entering into a new territory, and there was not yet a story that I knew that would guide me for this part of the journey. And it almost feels like everything we've talked about today leads to a point where none of the stories that have gone before us are fitting for what follows, and that we need a new story for humanity, and that we're at the beginning of a fork in the road where we can either continue down the path of old stories repeating themselves, or those in the middle of that space between the A and B reality who step back and breathe and say there is another way. Perhaps there is a space for those of us who are recognizing that space to walk into that boldly and bravely and seek to carve a new story that hasn't preceded us.
it's not just human beings that have a lifespan who are born and live and evolve and die. Archetypes themselves have an existence. And we are in a time like the profundity of the change that is possible for humanity goes all the way down to the level of our archetypes. New archetypes will be born, and old ones will transition. They will die, or they will metamorphosize into something else. They will become something different, just as a man or a woman becomes something different as he or she passes various life initiations. So I think it is a good time. This is part of what I mean by standing in the unknowing. And the election may not mean what we think it does. The equipment, the conceptual equipment that we have inherited is incapable of recognizing some of these new storylines, these new plot lines, these new archetypes. They're just not in our vocabulary. So we have to let go of all of these narrative templates that try to force things into conformity with them. You look at a situation, you watch a movie, 5 minutes into the movie, you're already thinking, okay, is that the good guy or the bad guy? Iron Man, the CEO of Iron Man's company. Oh, he's a bad guy. I can tell. And now I know the plot. There's going to be some big confrontation with him, and the plot will be resolved when that dude is killed. Right. And that's maybe an extreme example, but this is, an example of forcing reality into the systems of understanding that we have inherited. And if we keep doing that, we are not going to be open to anything new. So that's why, I've raised 4 children, but with the youngest, I'm especially vigilant. When he was little, I was especially vigilant about making sure that he was exposed to plot lines that were not about good overcoming evil. They were not about the hero's journey. They were not about, and I let him watch those too, but to make sure that there was, some other ones that give him a precedent for a new understanding, new for civilization anyway.
Kill me with this one. I mean, my son is 3 years old, and he's literally at this moment, at this phase of his life, he's running it. Like literally last night, he's talking about, I got to catch the baddies. I want to be a superhero. Right. He's fallen into those narratives. Not fallen. I mean, they are in this. To ignore them would be to ignore a piece of our history. But you're absolutely right. The consciousness of that and recognizing that is not the only narrative, and that, you know, his
Right.
innate creativity as a young, impressionable mind can form his own narratives that are distinct.
Yeah. And it's okay for a 3-year-old. Like, that actually is a very adolescent, it's like a childish way of looking at the world,
Yeah.
you know? But he needs to be seeded with other things too. So, for example, uh, my favorite film for little kids, I mean, I don't know, for 3-year-olds, maybe they shouldn't actually be on screens at all. But, but, you know, the first, you know, they're going to be exposed to it eventually. And so, you know, my favorite for little kids is My Neighbor Totoro, Miyazaki movie that is, you know, and some other Miyazaki movies as well. For slightly older kids, The Boy and the Heron, Spirited Away, but especially My Neighbor Totoro. The plot does not depend on conflict. Can you imagine that? How can you make a story, an interesting movie that does not depend on conflict? It's profound, you know. So I really, it was important to me to introduce that into my son's DNA. And
Thank you for those recommendations. I may have to break some of the principles to get those in early. But on that point, to close, I'm experimenting with a new way to close our interviews. You've talked about peace consciousness through this, and through the course of the pandemic, you know, I became someone who wanted to understand what was happening, why, and just looking at it systemically. And I've read so much, like thousands of articles, to really understand it. But even in the absence of all that, even the absence of understanding, my fundamental principle of freedom guided me throughout. Now, in the world that we're living in a world of increasing conflict, and I read a stat today that said we are in a period since World War II where there has never been greater conflict in the world, in this period since peacetime after World War II. What guides me in the absence of any understanding, because I am naive to the conflicts of the world, other than the kind of perhaps understanding of the human condition to a degree, I'm guided by the principle of peace. And my next guest is going to be Scott Horton, and I'm talking to Scott about the absence of a global peace movement in this age, akin to what we witnessed in the 60s. So I want to close by leaving you with a question. What question should I ask Scott, or what reflection would you like to share with Scott to pick up the thread on this discussion in order to expand this idea of peace consciousness and living in a world that is free from conflict? I struggle to believe that it's not. How is it not possible in human evolution to eradicate physical violence without imposing the type of zero-sum thinking that we've alluded to?
yeah, I mean, I think that a certain amount of conflict is inevitable in human affairs, but that we increase it by orders of magnitude through uh, the ideological lens through which we see the world. The foundation of war is dehumanization. It's judgment. It's and the whole good and evil division is kind of a special case of that. But basically, we make other human beings into others through dehumanization. We, you know, make them less than ourselves. If I were in their situation, I wouldn't be a terrorist. I wouldn't do what they have done. Well, really? Do you know that for sure? That if you were in the totality of their situation, that you wouldn't do as they've done? As long as we believe that, there will always be war. There will always be prisons. There will always be totalitarianism. There will always be genocide. Now, there may be still, even without all of that, there might still be some violence. There might still be some psychopathic individuals who need to be separated from society. We still have a need to set boundaries. I'm not saying that all conflict will disappear if we erase the foundation of judgment and dehumanization. But that's, when I'm in dialogues around peace, that's what I always like to bring into it. Because we're not going to, the grief and horror and shame that comes when we see what we have done to each other, that alone is not enough to arrest the cycle. If that were going to stop, if previous genocide was going to stop the next genocide, it would have stopped a long time ago. Something else has to change. And maybe I would ask Scott Orton, what has to change in the basic way that human beings see each other and the world for there to be peace?
Wonderful. That will be a guiding question that I ask Scott in our next interview, where we're exploring this subject of how do we create a world with peace. Charles, this has been an expansive conversation as always. Thank you so much for your wisdom, your insights, for the work that you're doing. It's just so powerful to be able to speak about these matters openly and create the space for the type of not only open understanding and openness that is required, I think, in order to create the space for new stories to emerge, but actually to stimulate the idea that we require these new stories in order to move towards a more beautiful future. The last thing I'd like to invite you to do is to share with our audience. Of course, we'll place the links inside of our description. Where would you like to most guide people to in the wake of this conversation if they'd like to continue the exploration with you from here?
I guess just my Substack is a good place to start, which is charleseisenstein.substack. Something or other.
we'll put that in the chat for you. And I would strongly encourage you to check out, as I mentioned during the course of this discussion, it was Charles's, one of his most recent articles that led us to as a stimulus for this conversation, which I think is so vital in the transition phase where we're in politically, societally, spiritually right now. So thanks again, Charles. And to everyone at home, please do let us know your thoughts, to comment in the chat about your reflections on today's discussion. Please do share this and do subscribe to us. We're available on all of the major platforms from YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, Spotify, Apple, etc. So please do subscribe, leave us a comment. And we do hope to see you very soon. And if you'd like to have advance access to conversations like this and to tune in live, then please do consider becoming a supporter of our show. It does help us to continue to produce conversations like this. And you can find out more about our Live Free and Prosper community over at danastingregory.com/supporter. Until next time, thank you, Charles. Thank you to everyone at home. We will see you very soon. And here's to a peaceful, free, and prosperous world.